Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Friedman, the co-director of the Miami, Florida European Union Center of Excellence. And I welcome all of you here today and thank you for coming to this wonderful event, to the visit of Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, head of the European Union delegation to the United States. We are honored and thrilled to have him here today. We're so grateful to the ambassador for choosing Miami as one of his destinations in these challenging times, so thank you. Before I formally introduce the ambassador, please allow me or indulge me to mention that the EU Center is held jointly with the University of Miami, our neighbors to the east. And let me take a moment to introduce Dr. Joaquin Roy. There you are, my counterpart at the University of Miami, who also has the distinguished honor of holding a Jean Monnet Chair ad personam. And we here at the EU Center in Miami are one of only 10 centers across the country to hold this honor, and we're one of only 10 designated as an EU Center of Excellence, which is funded by the European Commission. And we've held this honor now for over a decade and are so grateful to the European Union delegation in DC and to the Commission for their continued support. So thank you, all of those here who represent those institutions. Thank you. Let me too thank the Broad family for their steadfast support of the School for International and Public Affairs. Dr. John Stack is not well, so he can't be here today, but on his behalf as well, I thank the Broads. It seems that they're not here either, so we just give a general thank you to them. Okay, I also briefly want to thank colleagues at FIU and in the community who have traveled to be here with us today. There are too many to mention by name, but we thank each and every one of you, general and honorary consuls, members of the business communities, the educational communities, teachers, students, high school and university alike. We could not do anything that we do here at FIU or at the center without you, so thank you for all of your support. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing to you Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, head of the EU delegation. Mr. Vale de Almeida, before taking his current post, served as the Director General for External Relations at the European Commission, the European Union's executive body. As the most senior official, he helped to formulate and implement the EU's foreign policy, and he played a central role in creating and preparing the European External Action Service, which was introduced by the Treaty of Lisbon. Mr. Vale de Almeida joined the EU Commission in 1982 in Lisbon, and before this service, he worked for many years as a journalist. He has a degree in history from the University of Lisbon, and I have to take a moment to say to the students out there who doubt whether historians, as a historian myself, can make anything of themselves, he is a prime example that you should major in history. Okay. He also studied journalism and management in many countries, including the US, Japan, France, and the UK. So without wasting any more of our time today, let me give you Ambassador Vale de Almeida, who will speak with us today about transatlantic relations in a turbulent time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you, all of you, for coming this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. We just arrived from Washington, D.C. I'll be followed by someone important tomorrow, I understand, in Miami. So it's a pleasure to start a round of important, interesting, I hope, conversations in this town. Let me thank all the organizers, all those that contributed to this event and to this opportunity which is given to me to discuss with you, the Shepherd Broad Foundation, certainly Rebecca Friedman and Christine Cali Sanchez. Where is she? She's over there. We work with them in extremely well, and they are fully committed to European studies and to the links between the US and the United States and the European Union. So I would like to praise their work and the work of all the teams that are committed to this kind of studies and promoting the interest about international relations and transatlantic ties in particular. The topic that you suggested for today has to do with the turbulent times. And coming over in the plane, I start wondering how do you define turbulent times? Well, what kind of concept is this? And if we look at today's world, it's not difficult, to understand why the times are turbulent. But at the same time, if you go back in history, and as an historian I try to do that all the time, you find it a little bit more difficult. For instance, we are not today in the state of war. We don't have a global state of war. There are no world wars going on. We don't have a generalized situation of regional wars. There is no clear and present danger of a nuclear confrontation around the globe. So if you look back to the last decades, the times we are living are relatively calm. It's a relatively calm period in the history of mankind if you go back to the last 4 or 5 decades. And if you go back and include, of course, the 2 world wars, even more so. But still, I think we agree that the times are turbulent. So my first exercise with you is to try to understand why these are turbulent times, even in spite of the fact that we are not, as much as before, in a state of war. So I'll try to identify 5 major changes that happened in the last years that condition and determine the way we live today. The first one is the fact that we have a new balance of power in the world. There is a power shift. Power is moving away from Europe and the US towards basically Asia, towards emerging economies. We had the end of the Cold War in the late 80s, early 90s, which was followed by the fall of the Soviet Empire. We came from a bipolar world in the sense that there were 2 polars, the United States and the Soviet Union, to a unipolar world in which for a few years the United States dominated largely, to a world which is now multipolar or interpolar, if you want to call it that way. Anyway, a much more complex system of influences and powers than before. And certainly, we all agree that there is a shift towards Asia. The second point has again to do with Asia, which is the rise of China. It's not only Asia, it's not only the Pacific region, it's the single country, China, rising to a new situation. This is not new in history again. China was very powerful many centuries ago. People tend to forget that. It doesn't come out of nothing, the rise of China. It has an historical trend. And this is, of course, a major factor in today's reality. China is today already an economic power. It will be a military power tomorrow. And this is a major factor, a major change that happened in the last 5-10 years. It's very recent, but very powerful and very influential in the way we understand the world today. The third change, big change, I would say, is the fact that the economy became global. Everything you buy here in Miami has components coming from all over the world, or is likely to have. It's very difficult today to determine this product is American or Chinese or Portuguese or Spanish. Free trade and technological developments, particularly in the area of communications, have determined that today our economy is a global one. Again, this is recent. We had other periods in history where there were other forms of globalization, including, started my own small country of origin, Portugal, which in fact created the first system of globalization to some extent back in the 15th, 16th century. today's globalization is the most important one ever, of course, because you have this combination of technology and free trade that creates a global market. This is new. This did not happen 10 or 15 years ago. So it's a major change that we need to accommodate to characterize today's world. The fourth big change is the fact that we have new security threats. During the Cold War, our threat was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union's threat was the West, NATO, the United States, the European countries. Because these two systems, capitalism on one side and socialism/communism on the other side, were the two models, the two reference models. The rest of the world was determined to one extent or the other by this confrontation. Today's threats are much more complex. They begin by the fact that it's very difficult to identify a country that is behind a threat. If you take terrorism, you don't say terrorism originates in this country and I have to blame this government for the fact that I am under a terrorist threat. Cyber attacks. You cannot identify the source of a cyber attack, let alone the country of origin of the cyber attack. So what you have today, and I could go on with many examples, is that you have new kinds of threat, which are, at the end of the day, much more difficult to deal with than the old threats. We knew the Soviets, we knew how many missiles they had, we knew how many nuclear warheads they had, we knew the location of those sites, they knew ours, and there was a balance of power. That's no longer the case today. All our societies are under new threats to their security, which are much more complex, much more sophisticated, and largely non-state-based. They are not linked to a state. They are not linked to a government. They are not linked to an organization that we know and can deal with, which makes, of course, our life much more difficult. There is another new security threat which did not exist during the Cold War, which is the risk of nuclear proliferation. With the breakdown of the Soviet Empire, with the breakdown of a number of countries and states that had sophisticated weaponry, the latest being Libya, for instance, which did not have a nuclear power, but still many weapons are going around out of Libya. But if I concentrate on the nuclear proliferation threat, you have two cases that come to mind: Iran and North Korea. But you have other countries with nuclear power that deserve some attention because of the instability of their political, social, economic situation. And some people like to mention the case of Pakistan, for that matter. So new threats, more complex to deal with, more sophisticated to identify, and certainly more difficult to fight. The fifth big change is what Zbigniew Brzezinski has called in a recent book, which I, by the way, recommend, a global political awakening. What you see today around the world, and to a large extent it started in the Arab countries, is the awakening of populations that want basically to determine their future. They want democracy, they want freedom, but they basically want to decide what their country looks like, what their lives should be like. And this is a phenomenon that is spreading across the world. And of course, it's a major factor in the way we deal with international situations. So here you have 5 I could identify 2 or 3 more. But these are, for me, the most fundamental changes that have occurred in the world in the last 10, 15 years, not more. 20 years, if you want, for some of them. But it's very recent in history. So this is today. This is the world changing as we watch it, as we observe it. But these 5 major changes, which can accommodate a sort of change of paradigm, have been sort of exacerbated by other 5 additional factors, which I would like also to identify. And that we are still trying to see what turbulent times mean. And these additional factors are, the first one, the 2008 financial crisis. The most important financial crisis, the most serious one since the 30s of the last century. Financial crisis in 2008 and 9 and all its aftershocks. And the situation in Europe is typically an aftershock of the financial crisis of 2008. I'm sure we will have a few questions about that when we come to our dialogue. The second additional factor of turbulence is the inadequacy of global governance instruments. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the United Nations. I'm talking about bodies in which countries try to find solutions for their problems. These bodies did not accompany the pace of change that I've just identified. The UN, to a very large number of observers, no longer reflects fully the reality of the world today. The G8 does not reflect the reality of the world. The G20 tries to reflect that reality in a different way, but has not yet managed to do so entirely. So we lack the mechanisms to govern the world which are appropriate to today's world. So there is a gap between what we have at our disposal to try to make this world evolve in the right direction and the reality that exists today as a result of these changes I've identified. The third factor, which is an additional factor of turbulence or change or uncertainty, is what we see in our industrialized, advanced democracies, which is a divorce between the public opinion and the political elite. I mean, you have that in this country illustrated by the very low level of support or recognition for the Congress, for the work of the Congress. You have it in Europe by the low level of turnout to elections because people simply don't bother to vote, because they don't trust the politicians, because they don't think that the politicians sort of reflect their way of thinking and their aspirations. And this divorce between the population and the political elites is, of course, very worrying. It can bring with it serious problems for our democracies. The fourth factor, additional factor I would identify is an ideological debate between different models of organization of our societies. Some of you may remember that after the fall of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War, some people say that this was the end of history. Typically and famously, Fukuyama published a book with that title. And this thesis was very simple. I mean, with the fall of the communist model, there's no model left but liberal capitalism, so it's over. So we are now safely on calm waters, and we just have to make it, the world model of governance of our societies. Well, today's reality has not confirmed Fukuyama's thesis. And in fact, what you have today is a debate between the kind of societies we live in here in this country or Europe, liberal democracies, to put it simply, and models that are not exactly like that. and in countries that I don't need to identify, where they have a different concept of organization of the society. Less freedom, less parties, less internet, more constraints on individual citizens of all sorts of nature. And these models, and you have 2 or 3 countries, part of the new emerging countries that in different ways pursue these kind of ways of organizing the society, are a temptation for other countries in the world that look at our democracies and see some failures, some weaknesses in our democracies, as we know they exist. So instead of having finished the ideological debate between models of society, we have a new discussion about this, which I think should make us think very hard. I'm talking about us, Europeans, but also Americans, on the ways we organize our own democracies, the need maybe to strengthen our democracies in order to make them more attractive, but also more capable of resisting some temptations or some tendencies here and there to the right and to the left of populism, in the way the Europeans refer to populism, and for solutions which may be less faithful to our principles of individual freedom, open market, respect for the rule of law and fundamental rights. And the last factor which, in my view, has accelerated and they exacerbated these changes, and in such is also an element of turbulence, is the new reality of the person-to-person communication in the world today. This has to do, of course, with the new technologies, the social media, all these new tools of communication that did not exist 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago, and which have completely changed the way we interact. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think it's rather good and bad, of course. But, I mean, as an observer, as someone who wants to understand why we are in turbulent times, I think they introduce a big change in the way our societies work. There's no longer an intermediate body between the news and the consumer of news. All of us are now journalists. It's enough to be at Twitter or to have Facebook. You are reporting about the reality, not necessarily knowing all the implications of that, and not necessarily being aware of the need to, when you communicate information, you are assuming an enormous responsibility. When I was a journalist many years ago, and that's still the case for those who are in the official journalism, you are, or some of them at least, you are bound by a number of rules that limit your capacity to spread the information if you have not checked it. One of the basic principles was you need to have two sources. You need to cross-check in order to be sure that what you are conveying to the larger public is the truth or is a verified fact. So I'm just throwing at you some elements that in this issue of person-to-person communication has made an enormous change. And of course, it has an impact on our societies. You've seen the Arab Spring, you've seen what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, you see the role of social media in these uprisings, which is a positive one, but it creates a new reality that we need to deal with. So these are some, I said 5 big changes that happen, in my view, creating a new paradigm in terms of the way the world is organized, exacerbated, accelerated by 5 more recent factors which make our world a turbulent one, even if we are not in a state of war, even if the intensity of war in the world is lower than many decades before us, but still we feel, maybe you don't, but I feel that the world is turbulent, that the world is finding its new patterns, and that is why and this is my second and final point, I believe it's so important and so crucial that the United States and the European Union try to act together, try to join efforts, and to see what they can do together. And my question is the EU-US Transatlantic Alliance relationship ties more or less necessary than after the Second World War? More or less necessary than during the Cold War? In my view, it is more necessary today than ever. A few ideas on how and why we should work together. First, because we have basically common problems. We are industrialized and post-industrialized countries, having advanced economies, being challenged by the emerging economies. And I'm oversimplifying. But we are at the same kind of level of maturity, if you want. Secondly, we have some important common strategic interests. We have to preserve our role in the world. No one wants to be in decline. No one wants to be a declining power. We want to preserve what we have. It's only normal and natural. We want to protect ourselves, in the good sense of the word, from competition of those who are able to produce better products, cheaper products, and are conquering market shares. And we want to protect our citizens from all the new security threats that I've identified earlier. So, just a few common strategic objectives that do not separate the EU and the US, they rather bring them together. But maybe most importantly, we have common values that we share across the Atlantic. Individual freedom. There is no other place in the world apart from, the United States, Canada, European Union, where you have such a degree of individual freedom. Other countries here and there, of course, but if you think yourself, where can I exercise my individual freedom better than anywhere else, that is the United States and Europe. But also we are very attached to the rule of law. Our societies are based on law. We want it to remain the case. And respect for fundamental rights. Again, this may seem obvious to some of us. It is not when we go elsewhere, when we consider the situation in other countries. And this should bring us together. So common problems, common strategic interests, and common values, this is the cement for a transatlantic relationship. And we should be proud of what we've done already. 2 world wars, where we fought fascism, basically, and dictatorial regimes. What we built across the Atlantic with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The way that the US and Europeans were able to build a democratic Europe, and the results that the European Union obtained by enlarging to the entire continent of Europe. What we've done together in different hotspots in the world. This is part of our heritage, of what we have achieved together, and we should be proud of that. So what can we do now? And I finish with these few remarks. What can we do now, EU and the US, to deal with the turbulent times that we're living today? I will leave you with 3 sorts of remarks. First, on the bilateral level. What can we do between the EU and the US specifically? I think we can and should maximize the economic potential of this relationship. China and India and Brazil and Asia Pacific, all this is relevant and important, and they are rising, and I don't oppose that, I don't question that. But I believe that across the Atlantic, and Miami is a very good place to talk about this, there is a dynamic economic relationship, a vibrant exchange in terms of goods, service, but also in terms of investment, that can produce even more, jobs, and can produce even more growth. So we need to maximize this potential. And we need to cooperate bilaterally in all sorts of policies, from the environment to all sorts of other areas where the government is active, where we can share good practices, can exchange experiences that we have in order to strengthen our societies and our democracies. The second track is foreign policy. We can solve problems together. We are actively doing so in the Arab world, in Iran, in Syria, in the Middle East, in the Balkans, just to name a few areas in which the cooperation between us and the Americans is extremely close. But we can do more than that. And particularly in times of financial and budgetary constraints, where we all have to cut somewhere because there's not enough money and we don't want to accumulate deficit and debt, the more we can do to share the burden, pooling and sharing on defense and security is of course most welcome, because it increases the effectiveness of what we do while reducing the budgetary impact of these policies. And the third level in which this alliance needs to do more and better, in my view, is as far as the global challenges are concerned. We live in one planet. There are not two Earths or three Earths. It's only one. The Chinese planet is the European planet, which is, by the way, Florida's planet as well. So, I mean, this is only one. There's no, no choice there. So we either find solutions together or we don't. And these issues have to do with natural issues linked to the planet as such, of which the most important one, in my point of view, is climate change and global warming. We can discuss that if we want. We believe this is a top priority. The second one is, of course, terrorism. No borders. They can attack Miami as much as Lisbon or Madrid. In fact, they have done so in some of these cities already. And nuclear proliferation, in which, again, the nightmare is, of course, a nuclear device falling in the hands of terrorism. When you sort of cross-fertilize these security threats, you can come to very, terrifying possibilities. And of course, there you can only achieve your goals if you cooperate at the international level. There's no other way. There's no way the US alone or Europe alone can do this. So three areas: the bilateral, pure economic and cooperation on policies; the foreign policy, trying to solve the problems of the world where they appear with joint action and sharing the burden of all these investments; and globally, taking care of the planet in a cooperative way. So, and my conclusion is, before I take your questions and comments, we do indeed live in turbulent times. They are different from the turbulent times we lived earlier in my generation and the generations before mine. But they are turbulent times. These times require more than ever a cooperation among those who consider to be best friends. And we are America's best friends, as it is proved again and again. Every time the Americans need support, those who are there all the time are the Europeans, and vice versa. And we need to start from that and build a solid, even more ambitious common agenda. I identified three areas in which we can do that work, and I hope that you share at least some of my remarks, and I hope that you can challenge some of them so that we have an even livelier dialogue. Thank you very much. Shall I take questions just like that? In an informal and... Okay. the microphone on the aisle there, so.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Rui Forcada. I'm the Honorary Consul of Portugal here in Miami.
Boa tarde, prazer em vê-lo.
O prazer é todo meu. Muito obrigado. I'm interested in a comment you made with regards to some government entities perhaps losing a little relevance in today's ever-changing world, and another comment you made that other government entities are incurring a lot of criticism in today's world. How do you see these entities regaining the confidence of their constituents and the people that they serve? Thank you.
Well, as far as world governance bodies, I can refer to the International Monetary Fund, for instance, in which up to the financial crisis of 2009, there was an absolute dominance of Europe and the US. With this crisis and with all the changes I've identified, the IMF is now under a profound change. It's not yet over. But this is a good example in which the role of China and the weight of China and Russia and Brazil and India has to be reflected, has to be changed in order to reflect the reality. You could consider the United States, the United Nations. I won't make any comment about the composition of the Security Council, because I'm not supposed to, but I think it's obvious for any observer that the reality of the late 40s, early 50s has changed. So I don't know when this change will be reflected or how, but I think I will not be fired if I say that maybe it deserves some attention. If you consider, as I said, the G8 and you consider the G20, which are informal groups, they attempt to have a role in global governance, but they are not legally binding, they are not formal bodies. They did a great job, and I've been Sherpa for both the G8 and the G20 for a number of years, and I know how important the G20 was, for instance, in responding to the financial crisis of 2009. But I also know that the G20 has lost a little bit of momentum today, and it needs some re-energizing. So these are some examples of where, and I could go on, the present instruments for global governance. What is global governance? It's trying to, make the world a less turbulent place and trying to find common solutions for problems. The world governance today is lacking in terms of efficiency and effectiveness because it does not necessarily fully reflect the new realities. But the new realities are very new. They are very recent. So one needs to also understand that these things take some time to adjust. But the pace of change has been such, and this is the impression I wanted to leave on you, and particularly the younger friends here, the pace of change in the last 10 years has been such, 10, 20 years, but even the last 6 months. I mean, things are changing so fast that the mechanisms of governance are not following. So there is a gap there. Well, the same applies to a large extent to the way our societies are organized. And, I think we agree that the relationship today between politicians and public opinion is not the best. In all our societies. There are issues about I don't trust politicians, or trying to find new parties, or abstaining from voting, or there is an issue there. And we know our democracies are not perfect, but they are still the best, so far, the best model. We need to try to make them more perfect than they are today. I think there has to be a serious debate how we do this. And otherwise, that's my earlier point, some other models of more robust central authority might be a temptation, not for our societies, but certainly for those who come next. The new emerging economies that are looking at ways how to organize themselves in Africa, Latin America, Asia. I think it's important that in the framework of the ideological debate not over yet, that we contribute to that by, in a way, making sure that our models are more attractive. And I think this is a common problem across the Atlantic. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. As an effect of the economic crisis, do you see the European Union on a faster way to a comparable to the United States of America, to the United States of Europe, with stronger joint institutions, the famous joint finance minister and so on?
Good. Let me say the following. We're talking about the economic situation in Europe, the euro area, sovereign debt crisis, so it's a big issue. But trying to restrict to your question, which is a very good one, I think if you look back again at the history of the European Union, so I support Rebecca, go for history, it gives you a good picture. Maybe not a very good job, but certainly a good picture, a good understanding of the world. But if you look back at the history of the European Union, and the Union is exactly my age, 55 years old, if you look back at the history, you will see us moving step by step, as our founding fathers suggested, and benefiting from each crisis to move a little bit further in terms, or a little bit deeper in terms of integration. And I'm going to the bottom line of my reasoning. What's happening today is the Union overcoming a crisis by becoming more integrated, not less integrated. So we are overcoming this crisis, as I believe we are, by adding to the European integration instead of taking away from the European integration. So the Union will come out of this crisis more integrated than before the crisis. And this is the sense of everything that our leaders are discussing and agreeing in terms of making the Union more a kind of United States of Europe than it was before the crisis started. Through, great difficulties and sacrifices. But our countries realize that in today's turbulent world, with all the threats, economic and security and otherwise that I tried to describe briefly, none of our countries alone is big enough, is strong enough, is solid enough to deal with all these problems. Only together they can do that. I wanted to go also to the younger part of the audience there, and not offending anybody on the first rows, but
Thank you very much.
then we have the lady there.
Over there?
No. First, you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Ambassador. My name is Javier. I'm a political science major here. I thank you for coming down to FIU. My question is, in the United States, we spend about 1% on foreign aid, and you were speaking about the United States and the European Union having to have more foreign policy, more foreign aid, because of the turbulent situations. Now, my question is, because of the current situation with Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, with the austerity measures and the credit crisis, what is the European Union's consensus with regards to spending on soft power, even though they're cutting back at home?
Well, that's a very good question and a difficult one. Of course, I mean, let's be frank. If you ask any voter in Europe if they want to have their unemployment benefits cut in favor of foreign aid, the answer is clear, right? So we shouldn't not go, have no illusions about that. So the situation is very difficult. Countries are making enormous sacrifices. So it's very difficult to keep the momentum for foreign aid, for aid to development. But I think politicians and diplomats have to keep on presenting the narrative. And the narrative is very clear. When I'm helping a country redress a difficult situation, I'm increasing my security. So it's not that I waste money by doing what I have to do in Libya. In doing so, I'm hopefully making my southern border more secure, more stable, more prosperous, which means that I'm more secure, more stable, and more prosperous. And if you're living in a globalized economy, even more so. You know, in the 14th century, we don't even know that there was, you know, Latin America or, you know, or Oceania or whatever. I mean, it was not part of our world. Today, it's next door. We exchange, we are impacted by them, we influence them. We live in the same village. So, but it's a difficult debate. It's a difficult debate that we have in Europe. But we are still the most important provider of development aid around the world. We want to do more with the United States, again, sharing the burden, pooling our resources so that we can work better. And again, there we are different from others, because there are a number of new actors in Africa, for instance, or in Latin America, providing money without the values that we support. For instance, we support democracy. We want good governance. We are against corruption. We want environmentally friendly development policies in these countries. Other people simply want to put the money, to reap the benefits, take away the commodities, and other things that I would not describe, and I'm not referring to anybody in particular, but maybe I am. The lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Ella Morera. I study international relations and political science. I'm happy to have you here at FIU. My question is if you see the organization of regional bodies as the future of the world. We see in Latin America, in the Middle East, even Russia has an initiative to form a Eastern European bloc. Do you see regionalism as the future of the world? Thank you.
Yeah, well, international relations is almost as good as history studies, so good choice, good choice. Yes, I think regional cooperation is part of the solutions of our problems, and you are not surprised that I say that, because that's our solution. That's what we decided to do in Europe after the Second World War, is to join efforts, you know, to concentrate on what we have in common and less on what separates us. And it's an incredible success, allow me to say this. In less than 60 years, we stopped wars in Europe, and this is the longest period of peace in European soil ever, or at least since historians started tracking these issues, longest period of peace in European soil, the last 60 years. We brought together countries that were separated by the Iron War, that were under dictatorship, right-wing and left-wing. All these are now together. And you have a continental Europe, the continent of Europe, which is largely covered by the European Union, democracy, prosperity, stability, security for these people, with the help of NATO and the United States. So our regional solution worked. So normal that we say, why don't you try this? A couple of examples. We are working very hard for many years with the countries of Southeast Asia. They have an organization called ASEAN, you know, bringing countries like, you know, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. And this is proven successful, not as successful as our experience, but now, let me tell you that in this part of Asia, because of the new influence and power of China, they are again looking very seriously at strengthening their regional process in order to be able to cope with a big partner, a big neighbor, in order to rebalance power over there. If you take the case of Latin America, you know, there are certainly many Latin American people around, and we know how creative Latin Americans are. So even in this case, in this particular area of regional integration, I can name you about 10 organizations that have flourished in Latin America, which one way or the other aim at creating regional bodies in Latin America. So I think in Latin America what we need now is to sort of downsize, streamline all these efforts and try to find the best way to deal with this situation. The same from Africa. There is an African Union in Africa which is largely modeled upon our own example. It's not working very well right now, I must say, but at least there is a start, there is an attempt to do that. So I very much favor that. I think the world as it is today, in order to become less turbulent and more prosperous and more secure, we have to go towards this kind of regional entities where countries that have things in common try to work together.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Aldo Fonseca. I'm the International Admissions Coordinator for FIU. My question is with regards to nuclear proliferation. Recently, the United States and the European Union has passed some of the toughest economic measures against Iran and their development of nuclear weapons so far. And there is suggestion that further covert action has been taken in the country. My question is, how does the United States and the European Union justify imposing these sanctions on a country with what they develop within their own borders with their own resources? Following up to, should economic and diplomatic pressures fail, is there consensus between the United States and the European Union about using military action?
Our purpose is very clear. We want a negotiated solution that would allow Iran to have a nuclear program for civilian use, and we believe this is a legitimate right of the Iranian people to use nuclear as for civilian purposes. We will not accept that Iran will equip itself with military nuclear capabilities. We believe this is in line with international law, the commitments made by Iran, and we want these commitments to be respected. We are following a double-track approach. We have offered negotiations to reach exactly the deal I've outlined, but we haven't seen progress on this track. At the same time, we have evidence that Iran continues to build up nuclear capabilities that could potentially have a military impact. And that is why, on both sides of the Atlantic, but also followed by other international partners, we had put on the table a very robust sanctions mechanism because we want to achieve our goal. But our goal remains a negotiated position. The most recent reaction from Iran to a letter from my boss, Cathy Ashton, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Policy and Security Affairs, the reply from Iran was relatively positive, so we are now analyzing this reply, and maybe we could go back to negotiations in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And we are fully determined to do that. But we are equally determined to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear military capability. That is our common position.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Eduardo Wright. I'm an international relations student here at FIU. And listening to your speech, it reminds me of a very wealthy family that wants to maintain its wealth with its own family. Of course, there's nothing wrong on this. That's why the UN, the European Union, tries to increase its support with the United States. However, both the European Union and the United States are trying to seek a status quo that is in the past and not a status quo that is probably going to be in the future. And also being Brazilian, it gives me a bias of analysis that it reminds me also of colonization speech coming from some countries in Europe that still see the emerging countries such as Brazil, the BRIC, and China as countries that aren't there right now and maybe in the future will take a long time. But we're seeing that this change is happening right now. This future as you are speaking in your lecture, it's turbulent because this is the present right now. These emerging countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, even South Africa are emerging, and they are right now the present, not only the future, which was spoken for so long. With turbulent times, shouldn't come a change in these colonist ideology as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Obrigado. Maybe I should have spoken Portuguese because I don't think I was clear enough in my point. And my point is not to reject change. My point is to adapt to change, and particularly make sure that the EU and the US cooperate better in order to adapt to this change. But let me be very clear. What has happened in China, Brazil, India, South Africa, very soon in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, hopefully a number of African countries, is everything we fought for in the European and the United States. We wanted these countries to come out of poverty. We wanted these populations to be able to share the benefits of our civilization, if you want to call it that way. We wanted also to have markets for our products. And the only way to do that is to develop your economies and to create a middle class in Brazil as it now exists, and in China and elsewhere. And we want your countries to reinforce their democratic systems. And I'm very happy to see a vibrant democracy in Brazil, whereas only a few years ago we had dictatorships there. And of course we are eager to have even more developments of this kind in other emerging economies. So don't get me wrong. All this is good, positive, and we fought for it. Our democracies were on the forefront of development aid, on promotion of democracy, on fighting dictatorships in this country. So this is a positive evolution. This is what we wanted to happen. The question is that we need to adapt. On our side, by doing some of the things I said. On your side, allow me to say so as well, with economic power comes global responsibility. You cannot be a new kid at the big table without sharing some of the responsibility that comes with that new situation. And if I think of a number of issues in which I would like, if I think of a number of global challenges, I would very much like some of the emerging economies to assume more of their responsibility. But this is a process that will take some time. And there is an interaction between those who are already at the big table and those who are arriving at the big table. But I don't see, frankly, in what we do, and certainly not on what I said, any element of wanting to preserve the past. I think what we need is to adapt to the future. And in this process, the industrialized economies, the older world, has to do a lot. You have to do a lot also to adapt to the new situation. So it's an interaction. That's why I was calling for new mechanisms of world governance, where you can have a bigger role, a bigger say, and that together we can find the right solutions. But what is happening, the changes I identified, particularly those that have to do with the emergence of new economies, this is great. This is great. This is what we fought for. Maybe a last couple of questions. The organizers allow me, because I see many hands around. Okay, Rebecca is the boss here.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Maria Diralas. I'm a student at the law school. With the current situation in Syria, do you see NATO intervening in a similar way as it did in Libya? Or do you feel it could hamper the situation in the Middle East, for example, with Iran being so close to Syria?
When I used to advise politicians more directly than I do today, I always told them, be aware of the last question. It's always the most difficult one, and where you risk saying things that you shouldn't. Now, on Syria, it's an extremely complex situation that has historical roots in the history of Syria, and I'm not an expert on Syria, but there are elements there that go way back in the history of Syria. It has a regional dimension. Syria is located in an extremely sensitive area of the globe, close to Israel, close to Turkey, close to Iran, close to Iraq. And that's enough to mention these countries for you to understand what we're talking about. The international community, with a few exceptions, is fully aligned in condemning what's happening now in Syria, in requesting the departure of President Assad. We are worried with the humanitarian situation, and we are trying to bring together all those that share our concerns. A meeting will take place Friday in Tunis, Tunisia, of what we call the Friends of Syria, including, of course, the United States and the European Union, to try to create mechanisms to support the Syrian people and accelerate the process of transition in Syria. But we should be aware of the fact that each case should be analyzed according to its own merits. And I hear here and there people saying, why don't you do in Syria what you did in Libya? The situation is very different, and we need to be careful in order not to mechanically apply models to different situations. What I would like to highlight is that only a few days ago in Washington, I was with Catherine Ashton, our High Representative, meeting with Secretary Clinton, discussing all these issues. What is important here is that EU and the US, as I explained earlier, are fully aligned in dealing with this issue, fully converging in the analysis, and fully committed to contribute to solutions. We hope that the United Nations Security Council could soon agree on a resolution. As you know, there are vetoes there of 2 permanent members. We hope this will be overcome. But now, if I may, the focus of our attention as we speak in the next couple of days will be on the humanitarian side. We are troubled by the sufferings of the Syrian people, and we will try to do our best to help them. Maybe the very last one, a gentleman who is filming all this, so.
I noticed that you talk of European Union as if it is a country. You're talking about foreign policy, talking about answering questions whether you will intervene in Syria. With what? You mentioned several strategic issues on which United States and European Union should cooperate. But don't you think this is a relationship that is unbalanced? Every time Europe goes into trouble, United States comes to solve it. You mentioned Balkans. Not all of the countries recognize Kosovo, for example. As soon as the United States left Bosnia, Bosnia is kind of sliding toward a new deadlock. And so where is the European Union in all these things? I can see countries, I can see Britain, France, Germany, but I don't see where is European Union, where is army, where is all these normal tools of foreign policy?
I don't claim, of course not, that the European Union is a country. I don't even claim that it is a federal state. It's not the United States of Europe. It's not a country. It's a group of countries that have shared sovereignty. In some areas, you have a EU policy. If you think of trade, if you think of agriculture, that is a EU policy. In the area of foreign and security policy, there are elements of a policy, but it's not entirely the case. But let me give you a few examples. The case of Libya. You say that all the time the US comes to the rescue of Europe. Well, I didn't see American planes in Libya. there were European planes in Libya. We were, in a concerted way, pooling and sharing resources. We had the common objective, and we worked together. Of course, you didn't see a European army, because there is no European army. But you saw European planes and European military means from different countries of the European Union working under a consensus of policy of the European Union. So not a country, not pretending to be, but in more and more areas of foreign policy, having a common position. Take the case of Iran. Sanctions are European Union sanctions. It's not German or Dutch or Portuguese sanctions. European sanctions decided by the 27 and applied by each national authority according to the same guidelines and the same rules. Syria, we have a common position on Syria. All the member states think the same way in terms of Syria. So, progressively, gradually enlarging the scope of our common positions on foreign policy, not a member state, not a single policy yet, but increasingly so. And when it comes to commit resources, when it comes to be there where we need to be, of course you mentioned the Balkans in the 90s. I see the case of Libya as being very different from the Balkans in the 90s and showing an evolution on the European side that we want to continue to see. Because, and let me conclude with this, in today's turbulent world, with all these changes that we are all trying to accommodate, and the emerging economies as well, we Europeans have realized that even the bigger countries in Europe are too small to deal with all the issues. And even the bigger countries in Europe, and if you take the case of Germany, where you have an extremely pro-European chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, always committed to finding European solutions, now driving the move towards a new treaty that brings European solutions to the euro area situation today. You see that even the most important country, the most powerful economy in the European Union, sees its future inside the European Union, not outside the European Union. And this is what drives us to getting closer and closer together, also on issues of foreign policy and security. So my very last word is to, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the excellent questions. And telling you, in particular those who are studying, but also those who are professors, go on and keep your interest in international affairs. Keep your interest in studying how the world is organized, because in fact, we are citizens of this world. And in a globalized economy, with the kind of communications tools that we have today, it's even more the case than before. So if we don't understand where we are in today's world, we don't understand Miami. We don't understand Florida. If we don't understand the United States, the Western Hemisphere, the way the world is organized, what happens in China or India or Brazil has an impact on us, and I think it's a positive one. Whatever happens in Miami, Florida, has an impact on other parts of the world. The crisis has shown how interconnected and interdependent we are. So the more intelligent ones are the ones who are capable to understand this and to invest in foreign studies and international relations, and that's your case, and I praise you for that. Thank you.